Each one of those required a lot of painstaking work. Each one required probable cause, and then that led to another search warrant, all with the goal of catching the guys that are poisoning our community.
Before the first light touched Minneapolis, the city was already under quiet siege. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just controlled movement, heavy boots on concrete, and doors taken in synchronized bursts across multiple neighborhoods. While most residents were still asleep, FBI and ICE units were already in position, sealing streets with practiced precision and surrounding targets before anyone inside understood what was happening. This was not a spontaneous arrest, not a routine warrant. It was the visible strike phase of a months-long hunt that had unfolded silently beneath the surface of the city. Inside the properties taken that morning, agents encountered large volumes of synthetic narcotics, illegal weapons, and the unmistakable architecture of a network built to shield itself through layered trust, compartmentalization, and discipline. This was not chaos. It was structure. And if a structure this organized could operate this confidently in the center of a major American city, the real question was no longer who was taken into custody that morning. The real question was how the network had managed to grow this deep before the knock ever came. The operation began without noise, but not without force. Across Minnesota, nearly simultaneously, FBI and ICE teams converged on multiple properties tied to the same fentanyl distribution pipeline. Every unit moved on a synchronized timeline. There was no margin for delay, no room for a second attempt. Unmarked vehicles rolled to curbs and stopped in silence. Doors opened. Agents stepped out in tight formations, splitting immediately into entry and perimeter elements. Alleys, stairwells, parking structures, all taken within seconds. Every location was treated as active and high risk, not because gunfire was expected, but because speed was the only shield against communication spreading faster than enforcement. The objective was direct and uncompromising. Enter everywhere at once, seize control immediately, leave the network no time to adapt. At one apartment complex, agents moved up concrete steps 2 at a time, boots landing with controlled impact. Hands were already positioned for breach before anyone inside reacted. Lights flicked on just as doors were forced open and sharp commands filled narrow hallways. Individuals were separated instantly, hands raised, bodies turned, corners cleared. Each room secured before the air itself had time to settle. Across the city, a garage door lifted just enough to reveal stacked containers and sealed boxes. It was raised fully, and the space was locked down within moments. There was no time to evaluate what had been found. Assessment would come later. In operations like this, control comes first. Evidence matters only after control is absolute. And control was absolute. The pattern repeated across the state inside a narrow operational window. Homes, apartments, and storage sites were taken under authority within minutes. Teams fractured into specialized elements the moment entry was achieved. One group handled occupants, one cleared interior spaces, one secured exits and perimeter. No overlap, no hesitation, no wasted movement. The execution felt mechanical. The pressure inside each room was anything but. Occupants struggled to process how many doors had opened at once and why there was suddenly nowhere left to go. Agents moved past personal belongings, furniture, and clutter without distraction, stopping only when something threatened the integrity of the scene. This was never about one suspect. It was a coordinated freeze of an entire operating structure. As rooms were cleared, indicators of organized activity surfaced without drama. Packages were stacked methodically, not hidden in panic. Scales and sealing equipment sat ready for use. Weapons were positioned where protection would matter most, near entrances and storage points, signaling that defensive planning had existed long before this morning. Nothing about these sites resembled street-level improvisation. Everything pointed to a system that expected longevity, privacy, protection. These were not transit points for random exchange. They were controlled redistribution hubs, places where the network paused, prepared, and expanded with confidence. Outside, perimeter teams held steady, eyes on windows and doors. Radios transmitted short, precise updates between units. Each update confirmed the same. Pattern? Control achieved. No escape, no injuries, no sustained resistance. The absence of chaos was not luck. It was timing. When coordinated operations fail, they fail because one location warns another. A single call, a single message, a single delay. That signal never moved. The silence between sites carried its own message. The network had been intercepted before it could speak. As additional properties were secured, the operation shifted from movement to stabilization. Individuals were seated, identified, and separated while agents conducted layered searches. Drawers opened, wall panels lifted, containers examined with deliberate care, and what had looked like ordinary residences only hours earlier was now being documented as part of something far larger. Not rushed, but controlled. Not chaotic, but deliberate. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. These properties were not random addresses. They had been selected, prepared, and linked with purpose. The individuals inside were not operating independently, and the materials recovered were not intended for personal consumption. Every detail pointed outward, toward coordination, toward distribution, toward a structure extending far beyond those walls. At this stage, one fact became unavoidable. The targets were not chosen because of who lived there, but because of what those locations functioned as. These were holding points, relay points, command nodes within a system engineered to move fentanyl efficiently through communities without attracting attention. Removing a single dealer from a corner would never disrupt this design. Removing one property would barely register. Only a synchronized strike treating every node as equally critical could interrupt the rhythm that kept supply flowing. That is why so many doors opened at once. That is why patience was not an option. As agents moved through the stabilization phase, the scale of coordination sharpened. Similar materials appeared across different sites, packaged, stored, and guarded in nearly identical fashion. The repetition was not coincidence. It reflected training, planning, operational discipline. The network had built habits that made it both efficient and difficult to detect. Under fluorescent light and federal documentation, those habits were now exposed. Each property told a fragment of the same narrative. Together they outlined something far larger than any single arrest. With statewide control established, operational command centers began consolidating data in real time. Names aligned with numbers, numbers aligned with addresses, movements aligned with timelines. What had begun as simultaneous entries evolved into a unified operation with a singular objective. The arrests were visible. The deeper success was structural. The system had been frozen long enough to map its full architecture. That architecture explained the rapid spread of fentanyl. It explained why isolated enforcement pressure had failed to slow the flow. The supply chain had not been linear. It had been layered. Before withdrawal, agents documented every room exactly as it was found. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. Every detail preserved for courtrooms and federal reports where the events of this morning would later be reconstructed under scrutiny. Outside, urgency gave way to precision. The sun rose over buildings that, from the street, looked unchanged. Sidewalks remained quiet. Neighbors would wake unaware that a concealed supply chain had been operating within walking distance of their routines. As teams regrouped, a larger question hung over the operation. Why commit this scale of federal resources to a single coordinated strike instead of continuing to handle cases one at a time? The answer was direct. Because what unfolded that morning was not a collection of drug cases. It was an ecosystem. Fentanyl was the product. Money was the engine. Property records and layered paperwork were the camouflage. Some layers appeared shielded by influence that complicated traditional local disruption models. That is when federal agencies move decisively, and that shift leads to the next phase. The focus moves from doors forced open to patterns traced backward. Investigators did not uncover this structure through charts alone. They followed movement. Fentanyl began appearing faster and cheaper across Minnesota. Patrol officers and emergency responders traced overlapping routes night after night. Pills surfaced during traffic stops, then during small-scale searches, then during welfare checks. Discoveries arrived closer together. The price slipped from $20 to single digits, then lower. That collapse was not weakness. It was saturation. Supply had grown strong enough to outrun fear. By the time the pattern became visible, distribution was already ahead of reaction. Agents did not remain behind desks analyzing spreadsheets. The trail forced them back into neighborhoods already marked by loss. They observed corners changing hands rapidly. New distributors replaced previous ones within days. The rhythm of supply could not be tracked through conversation alone. It had to be followed through movement, and that movement pointed to something structured, intentional, and expanding faster than traditional enforcement cycles could match. When overdose calls began spiking in tight geographic clusters, vehicles moved again. Lights off, radios low. Units tracked where harm appeared first, not where it was reported loudest. Each response added another point to the map, and each point shifted the pattern further away from coincidence and closer to design. The price drop was felt before it was calculated. Communities sense imbalance long before official numbers confirm it. Dealers moved faster and argued less. Buyers hesitated less. Transactions lost their tension and became routine. Cheap product flooded confined spaces where enforcement pressure should have forced scarcity. That contradiction mattered. In environments where pressure rises, prices typically climb. Risk inflates cost. Here, the opposite occurred. Prices collapsed. The only explanation consistent with movement on the ground was depth, a supply line, rooted deeply enough to absorb risk while harm spread rapidly through families, blocks, and sleepless nights without warning. Following money required patience equal to any pursuit on the street. Profit leaves quieter tracks than narcotics. Payments surfaced in small increments, routed through ordinary channels designed to blend into daily life. Rent was paid on time. Utilities remained active. From the outside, properties appeared stable. Inside, the flow never stopped. Cash moved in cycles that mirrored supply rhythms, not pay schedules. Each cycle reinforced the previous one. Watching that motion revealed where the network breathed and where it concealed its weight. Behind familiar doors, inside quiet hallways, within trusted addresses across neighborhoods long overlooked. This realization forced a structural shift. No single city unit could reach far enough alone. Local arrests interrupted moments, not systems. Every vacuum filled itself quickly. The pattern demanded scale. It required coordination and authority capable of crossing jurisdictional lines. Each discovery pushed the investigation outward and upward simultaneously. The objective evolved from seizing product to cutting the paths that sustained it, wherever those paths led. That pursuit moved through housing records, financial transfers, layered paperwork, and protective buffers that allowed supply to continue despite visible street-level pressure. Sirens sounded outside, yet unseen frameworks remained intact. The answer pointed back to buildings. Concrete holds what individuals cannot carry. Teams revisited properties already secured, now viewing them with sharper analytical focus. Houses, apartments, and storage units formed a quiet web. Each node served a defined function. Goods arrived, stabilized, were divided, and moved again, all within walls designed to appear ordinary. Control of space granted the network time. Time enabled recovery. Recovery ensured continuity. Operations could reset, daily without visible disruption. Neighbors passed without suspicion, unaware of the weight contained inside those walls. Morning routines remained unchanged. Nightfall brought no visible alarms. Some sites surprised even experienced teams, not because of what they concealed, but because of how normal they appeared. Clean entryways, sorted mail, lights operating on predictable schedules, no visible signs of urgency or fear. That normalcy was the camouflage. Movement followed strict internal order, indicating careful selection of properties. The network relied on physical space more than individuals. Walls do not panic. Leases do not confess. Structures endure pressure more reliably than people. That reliance allowed operations to persist quietly for weeks, months, even years, until that morning forced exposure. Breaking that trust required more than detentions. Empty rooms can be refilled. Systems rebuild faster than reputations collapse. Teams moved beyond removal of individuals. They stripped locations of operational value. Containers were seized, access points neutralized, keys rendered meaningless. By the time agents stepped away, those spaces could no longer function as nodes within the structure that shaped them. The intent was structural collapse, not temporary disruption. That distinction carried greater weight than any individual arrest. Recovery requires storage. It requires staging ground. It requires predictable routes. All were denied simultaneously. Silence replaced motion. Routes ended abruptly across the region. As operational control expanded, a broader outline emerged. This story extended beyond one city. Parallel actions were unfolding elsewhere under the same logic and driven by the same threat profile. Minnesota was not isolated. It was a visible example of what occurs when supply outruns traditional oversight mechanisms. The operation did not mark an endpoint. It became a reference model, and its scale suggested pressure, building far beyond state lines. This was not a local storm. It was one front in a wider formation. Patterns were being observed elsewhere. Similar movements tracked, similar supply shifts measured. Federal agencies were preparing comparable actions in other regions, watching for the same convergence points and waiting for the same narrow windows where speed could override warning. Under cover of darkness and lawful authority, properties were stripped of function and routes were exposed. As teams withdrew and reports began consolidating, one question remained unavoidable. Was this a correction or the opening strike of something far broader? The evidence leaned toward expansion. The conditions that allowed this network to grow were not unique to one state. They existed across multiple jurisdictions where supply chains exploit stability, anonymity, and time. That reality pushes the story beyond Minnesota and into a larger operational campaign now taking shape across the country. Other cities, other neighborhoods, other quiet mornings where doors open without warning. The Minnesota operation was not random. It represented the first visible phase of a broader strategy targeting a distribution structure that had rooted itself deeply within the Midwest. Federal tracking of fentanyl movement had been ongoing for months, but as volume increased and pricing collapsed, it became clear that Minnesota was functioning as more than a transit corridor. It had become a distribution anchor point. Fentanyl, a highly potent synthetic opioid, had expanded beyond expected boundaries. What began as isolated seizures evolved into interconnected cases. The price decline was sharp and sustained. The product appeared in neighborhoods where it had not previously circulated at scale. This was not a temporary spike in street-level activity. It reflected structural overcapacity. When supply overwhelms demand in high-risk markets, it signals confidence within the upstream system. Minnesota was not merely a pass-through location. It had become a stabilization hub. As federal coordination intensified, the scope widened. The challenge was no longer limited to identifying distributors. The network had embedded itself within everyday infrastructure. Addressing it required more than sequential arrests. It required structural disruption. Properties played a central role. Financial flows moved through layered channels designed to appear ordinary. Documentation and ownership structures created distance between activity and accountability. By the time enforcement escalated, the network had already expanded beyond isolated nodes. This was not simply about narcotics moving across state lines. It was about operational control. Control of property, control of capital flow, and control of distribution timing. Each property linked to the structure served a defined function: storage, division, repackaging, temporary stabilization before redistribution. When one node was interrupted, another compensated. That elasticity made the network resilient. The city became a critical pressure point because the infrastructure supporting distribution had matured. It was not only the drug itself that posed the threat. It was the architecture enabling its movement. Buildings used as staging points, residential units repurposed for logistical resets, and financial mechanisms sustaining operational continuity. Investigators began connecting these elements into a unified framework. These were not isolated individuals operating independently. They were components within a coordinated machine engineered for durability. The significance of the operation extended far beyond removing product from circulation. The objective was systemic. Federal agencies focused on dismantling the enabling framework, the real estate footprint, the financial routing, the compartmentalized layers that allowed the trade to regenerate. Without property access, distribution slows. Without funding continuity, supply destabilizes. The campaign in Minnesota demonstrated that removing individuals was insufficient. The structure itself had to be identified, mapped, and neutralized. And that mapping process was no longer confined to one state. The objective was never symbolic disruption. It was structural collapse. That is why the raid was not an isolated event. It was one phase of a broader strategy designed to weaken the organization at every level simultaneously. As agents traced financial transfers, property records, and operational movement, the scale of infiltration became clearer. This was not about one dealer, not one stash house, not one block. It was about a system spanning the city, linking individuals, addresses, and capital flows in a configuration deliberately built to resist detection. The structure had been operating quietly for years, refining itself, adapting to pressure, and minimizing exposure. Only when volumes surged and patterns aligned did the full picture emerge. With each arrest, the investigation widened rather than narrowed. Street-level enforcement was only the surface layer. The deeper focus shifted toward identifying the protective mechanisms that allowed the network to expand uninterrupted. What investigators uncovered was not just distribution activity, but layered insulation, influence channels, financial buffers, and structural safeguards that delayed scrutiny and complicated intervention. This was no longer a drug case. It was a systemic confrontation. The central question became unavoidable. Why commit this level of federal coordination instead of continuing incremental arrests? Because incremental disruption had already proven insufficient. The fentanyl crisis was not sustained by individuals alone. It was sustained by infrastructure, properties providing operational continuity, financial mechanisms stabilizing revenue, and protective relationships reducing exposure risk. Addressing it required scale. As federal coordination intensified, the network was forced to adjust. Minnesota's role in the wider fentanyl distribution pattern grew clearer. What had appeared localized revealed national connectivity. Movement patterns, supply timing, and financial routing extended beyond state lines. This was no longer a matter confined to municipal boundaries. The challenge demanded national alignment, cross-jurisdictional authority, and structural dismantling rather than piecemeal enforcement. As analysis deepened, it became evident that the network's reach extended beyond Minnesota. Distribution pathways intersected with broader organized structures operating across multiple states. The fentanyl crisis was not contained geographically. It was integrated into larger criminal ecosystems that thrived on mobility, compartmentalization, and layered protection. The investigation was entering a new phase. The next objective was not only to trace where product moved, but to identify how operational shielding functioned, how influence networks reduced friction, how documentation masked activity, and how logistical continuity was preserved despite visible enforcement pressure. The Minnesota operation revealed more than seizures and arrests. It exposed a coordinated framework embedded within ordinary infrastructure. What began as targeted action against fentanyl trafficking evolved into a strategic campaign against an interconnected system spanning real estate, financial routing, and operational influence. From the first coordinated entry to the neutralization of distribution properties, the investigation uncovered a structured web linking distributors, business fronts, and administrative intermediaries whose roles were designed to fragment accountability. This was not random saturation of narcotics in neighborhoods. It was engineered distribution, supported by layered insulation. Minnesota, once considered one node among many in the broader opioid crisis, emerged as a strategic pressure point within a nationwide operational map. The state was not confronting isolated dealers. It had become a visible intersection within a coordinated structure extending far beyond local geography. The depth of integration surprised even experienced investigators. What appeared routine at the surface level concealed deliberate complexity beneath. As enforcement escalated, parallel legal and administrative processes began unfolding alongside physical operations. The structural implications were as significant as the tactical actions. What was being challenged was not only supply, but the network's confidence in its own durability. And that shift may prove more consequential than any single arrest. As the operation unfolded, another layer surfaced, one that raised difficult but necessary questions. In complex networks like this, institutional gaps, administrative blind spots, and delayed oversight can create space where criminal structures grow unnoticed. Whether through negligence, bureaucratic friction, or calculated shielding, the effect is the same. Protection forms around the system, and that raises a critical issue. Was this network merely tolerated by weakness in oversight, or did it actively exploit structural blind spots that slowed accountability? The next phase will determine the answer. If sustained federal pressure continues, targeting not just individuals but the infrastructure beneath them, the structure can fracture permanently. Distribution routes can destabilize, financial cycles can break, properties can lose function. Over time, the network weakens. But if pressure fragments, if coordination slows, if attention shifts elsewhere, systems like this do not disappear. They adapt, they reorganize, they return more disciplined than before. The question now is not whether arrests were made. The question is whether the intensity will hold. Minnesota's exposure revealed more than narcotics trafficking. It revealed how drugs, capital, flow, property control, and influence mechanisms can align into something far more durable than street-level crime. Sustained effort determines whether that durability collapses or recalibrates. One reality remains constant. Systems regenerate when space is created for them. What happens next depends on how long the pressure remains structural rather than symbolic. If you want deeper breakdowns of operations like this, analysis of how these systems function, and updates as this national campaign develops, subscribe to State Tone, like this video, and share it. Your engagement helps keep attention where it matters. And now the real question. In a system where supply chains, money movement, and influence layers intersect, where do you believe the true breaking point exists? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.